Good morning. I appreciate that my mere presence at the podium packs the crowd in the way it does. It's very gratifying. Restores my fragile ego. All right, so as we're going to present the Groves Award, and then the people from the great state of Utah and Salt Lake City will talk briefly about next year's Congress, and then Peter Calthorpe one of the 6 founders of CNU, will present his speech. And then immediately after that, we will be heading for the photographer, and Victor Dover with a bullhorn in his hand will be over in that corner directing you where to go, so you can have your picture taken as one of the people at the 20th test. Very good, check. All right, so it worked. You could hear that. And so that means everybody has to move this has to be mass crowd movement without danger, move steadily, no running, and we get there and take this picture because time will be short. All right, now, Ken Groves. For those of you that know Ken Groves, you know what a great man he was. For those of you that don't, we're going to tell you. Ken Groves was the visionary planner of Montgomery, Alabama, a place where you couldn't even get a meal after about 6 o'clock at night in their downtown. When Ken became planner, I went down there and with my family, and we tried to eat downtown, and we couldn't find a place to eat. And I told Ken about that, and he said, "I'm working on it." And he did. And downtown Montgomery is becoming a very interesting and exciting place, and the design concepts that Ken has put in place are being carried on by the people that have succeeded him. The Ken Groves Award is an award that goes to somebody that lives up to the vision that Ken had, and Mathew McElroy, the Director of Planning in El Paso, Texas, is this year's recipient. Joining me on the stage to give this award is Jason King, who's the jury chair for the Transect Codes Council. You want to come up? And Mathew McElroy is getting this award because of his leadership in multiple smart code rezonings throughout the city of El Paso. I know these are working because a developer that was visiting in Chicago complained about how, no, he noticed them, and he actually appreciated the work that the city of El Paso has done to create certainty in zoning, which is something developers really appreciate. Leadership in adopting new urban and transect-based plans citywide, and commitment to CNU accreditation. I think it must be close to half the population of El Paso is now CNUA, thanks to the work of Mathew McElroy and his allies. And so at this time, if you could come forward, and Jason and I will present you the award.
Quick intro. So my name is Jason King. I work for Dover Cohen Partners, and this year I was the jury chair for the Transit Code Council in presenting the award. There were a lot of great applicants. Mathew has stood out in terms of leadership through a long, difficult, but important comprehensive plan process. As John pointed out, in order to do business in the city of El Paso, you have to have someone on your staff who is CNU accredited. And he himself has helped lead multiple classes, taught people, from directors of streets department and engineering to public works to police and fire, all to become CNU accredited. So I think by the end of the year there'll be something like over 130 staff members in his department that will be committed to the new urbanism, and that's very important. So with that, a few words from Matthew. Thank you.
See if I can find a place for my papers here. Good morning. I first want to thank the Congress and the Transit Codes Council for this award, but I want to make it clear that this award was a team effort. I was fortunate enough to work with some of the most talented people I've ever met on all of the things that we did in El Paso. First, thank you to my wife, Melissa, for your constant support and encouragement. You're coming to love El Paso as much as I do. Next, to Dover Cole and Partners, a town planning firm of unmitigated awesomeness. Victor Dover, Joe Cole, and Jason King are absolutely fantastic. Fred Lopez and Carlos Gallanar, if they could stand for me real quick. Those two guys back there pushed with me every day for 2 years to get a comprehensive plan adopted, and are supremely gifted planners to whom I owe a great debt. Thank you also to our city manager, Joyce Wilson, who was a steadfast supporter, to placemakers, Hazel and Susan, for starting us down the smart code road. And finally, to a visionary city council who allowed the full team that I just mentioned to use state-of-the-art planning to reshape a city. And here's what we did. In the course of 2 years, we went from no members of the Congress of the New Urbanism to 150. And those 150, over the course of the 2 years, sat through 13 weeks of instruction to take the CNUA exam. It's a great exam for markets like mine, but it's an exam that needs to get better. But the commitment that they showed to participate in instruction for 13 weeks for all of those people to sit for and take the exam. But we didn't do that. We passed a new urbanist comprehensive plan. We reformed our subdivision and zoning codes. You have to have a CNUA accredited member on your team if you want to do work on the city's capital, on any of the city's capital projects. We've adopted the ITE manual as a required practice for any city capital project. And by the end of this year, we'll probably have close to 2,200 to 2,300 acres master planned and zoned under the SMART code in El Paso. And that's the good news. The caution I would give us all is that we have miles to go before we sleep. We have gathered here at the Congress, the very top of the field, the innovators, the early adopters, and maybe even the early majority. But in markets like mine, in markets of many of the other planning directors I talk to, we have miles to go. We have accepted that those things that are in the charter are the truths that can build better places, but we must endeavor to get to places like mine. Places in the West, all of the places where the default development type is still conventional. And I believe we can. If I didn't, I wouldn't have started down the road that the new urbanism provides. But I'm also a pragmatist. So for me, it was easy to adopt the new urbanism without full evidence of its truth. But not everybody is that easy. As a public planner, I can tell you that there are governments left, local governments left all over, that would rather just not bother because the battle can become too much. You can just ask anyone who's been forwarded an Agenda 21 blog right before the start of a charrette. As new urbanists, especially those of us who are public planners, we should be more pragmatic. We cannot believe, as William James describes, that it is better to keep out of battle than to risk a single wound. Those of you who know the last 30 days of our Plan El Paso adoption process will appreciate that. I hope that I've given you a bit of a challenge, and I'll leave you with some wisdom from George Kessler, who was the inspiration for our 1925 comprehensive plan, or who wrote our 1925 comprehensive plan and was the inspiration for much of Plan El Paso. And it's this: We must deal with the entire city. The object is to make cities decent for masses of people to live in. Thank you.
Okay, Mike Hathorn, come on up. He's going to talk about CNU 21. And I just want you to know that interesting fact about El Paso, other than the fact that I served in the Army there, is that El Paso was one of 9 cities in 1970 that had a rail transit system. And they took it out 4 years later. And so they made one of the greatest blunders in the history of American city governance. But now, under Mathew McElroy, they're correcting a lot of those mistakes, and it's really great. All right, Michael.
Good morning. My name is Mike Hathorn. I am the local host committee chair for CNU 21. And up on stage with me are members of the local host committee that will be responsible for the preparations relative to CNU 21 next year. I think it's appropriate as we start to give a big thank you to West Palm Beach and to the CNU 20 local host committee for all the work that was done for this Congress. There's a lot of work that goes into the preparations, and having been involved with that to this point in reference to Salt Lake City, I can fully appreciate the work that they've done, and I'm very appreciative to them for being our hosts, and I think we owe them our gratitude for their work. It was back at CNU 16 in Austin, Texas, that the idea started to take hold that Salt Lake City could potentially serve as a host city for one of these congresses. And as the idea for that started to take hold and momentum started to build for Salt Lake City to serve as a host for a CNU Congress, the work started and the efforts were underway to try and personalize what a Congress in Salt Lake City would mean to Salt Lake, to the Wasatch Front as a region, and what could be offered to all of you as you come into Salt Lake City and participate with us in a Congress. Part of that mission was to determine what the theme for Salt Lake City and CNU 21 should be. For those of you that have spent time in Salt Lake City, it's very apparent when you're in Salt Lake that there's a relationship that exists between the city itself and the natural environment that is literally at the edges of the city. The mountains are at times feel like they're right there on top of the city. And so there's this relationship between the human habitat and the natural habitat that's very apparent. There's also culturally an understanding in terms of the social bonds that exist between people and place. And as we grabbed onto these ideas, we realized that that was really something that we felt could be shared, and that message could be actually tailored and become part of the contribution that exists between a Congress and the host city. And so we wanted to do our best to embrace that. So what we came to was the idea that the theme for Salt Lake City should be living community. And I want to give you a definition for this because I think it's important to understand what that means to us as a local host committee. And I want you to understand the dynamic the dynamic means of what living community is. So we've defined living community as a product of the relationship between the lives of people, the creation of place, and their impacts on society and nature. What we'd like to do is we have an introductory video that we'd like to share with all of you to introduce you to Salt Lake City, introduce you to the theme, and give you a flavor for what you can experience next year in Salt Lake City.
Nestled between the Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake City is rich in geologic and human history, culture, recreation, and innovation. In 1847, Mormon settlers came seeking a better life. These pioneers were innovators in agriculture, transportation, planning, and industry. Living Community, the theme for CNU 21, captures the spirit of our predecessors, still alive in today's Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City has made great progress in recent years, from visionary grassroots planning initiatives like Envision Utah, an immensely successful Winter Olympics, and innovative public and private investments, both grand and small, through a period of economic turmoil. Salt Lake City is a model for living community.
In Salt Lake City, we have taken great strides to move towards our common goal and your objective of having a livable, exciting urban environment. We have undertaken and are moving quickly through a complete recodification for creating the kind of mobility we want in our community, for creating the kind of land use ordinance that allows for form-based and energy-oriented, renewable energy-oriented development, for providing for urban agriculture, whether that's farming in people's yards or being able to zone properly spaces for agriculture throughout our community and draw on our great heritage there. So this is an exciting time in Salt Lake. We look forward to your arrival here. We look forward to your critique and offer of advice on how we can advance further and more quickly the objectives we have to be the most livable city and a truly great American city by our own standards, which centers around the same values that you have with the Congress of New Urbanism for a vibrant, livable, sustainable community.
Living community is about evolving and adapting to opportunities and challenges. Salt Lake City is a fast-growing region, which is exciting for planners, designers, and developers, but is also a risk to future generations if we don't respond well to complex urban issues. We have seen tremendous success in bringing together diverse voices to shape a vision for our future, and we are working to see our plans come to fruition. Through groundbreaking research at the University of Utah's College of Architecture and Planning, partners like Envision Utah, and engaged and innovative professional community, we have ample reason to believe that great things will continue to happen. Come to Salt Lake City to learn.
Living community is about cooperation and partnerships. Salt Lake City has been recognized as a top place in the world for doing business. This speaks volumes about our entrepreneurial business community, our youthful population that is educated and connected, and the strength of good governance. Over the past decade, we have invested wisely in multimodal transportation systems that have put equal focus on streets and highways, transit, bicycle, and pedestrian facilities. We are growing our cultural core with new facilities for our creative industries. We have seen unprecedented private investment in projects such as City Creek Center in downtown Salt Lake City and the Daybreak Community, a model sustainable development for our region and the country. Come to Salt Lake City to share.
Living community recognizes the connection between people and place. Our alpine forests, our arid valleys, desert plateaus, and red rock canyons create a beautiful backdrop for our unique city. We value and are connected to our natural world, which sustains us, and are working hard to create a vibrant urban place that treads lightly on the earth. Our vitality comes through our diversity. Salt Lake City offers something for everyone. We welcome the world to share in our experience, whether you're here to live, to learn, to work, or to play. Come to Salt Lake City to explore.
The Grand America Hotel and Conference Center looks forward to hosting CNU 21. The hotel is central to downtown Salt Lake City and the region. The hotel and its staff are confident that your experience here will exceed your expectations and that your experience will be unforgettable. Join us in Salt Lake City in 2013 from May 29th through June 1st. Whether you're a designer, developer, planner, or government official, come experience our amazing city and region. See the progress we're making and share ideas with professionals from around the country and the world dedicated to the art of living community.
Well, we're looking forward to hosting all of you next year in Salt Lake City. We anticipate a lot of build-up towards that and look forward to the engagement with all of you as we work towards next year. We're gonna share a taste of Salt Lake City with you. It's part of the culture that during a parade of 4th of July parade or a Pioneer parade in Utah, that they do a taffy toss. So we brought some saltwater taffy from Salt Lake City, and hopefully all of you have good hands and spry reflexes to receive the gift of taffy. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and we look forward to seeing you in Salt Lake City next spring.
Here, Mike, have a taffy. Okay. Though, when you get involved with CNU, you do it because you want to have an impact on the world. You want a role model for having an impact on this world. Peter Calthorpe would be a good place to start, and you can see his work in places like Portland, and you'd expect it there because they had the kind of leadership that invited somebody like Peter Calthorpe to come there. You could see it in California, where the land use plan has Peter's fingerprints all over it. But Utah? Yeah, Utah. Peter Calthorpe has had a lot to do with what's happened. Maybe it wouldn't have happened if he hadn't been brought there. And it's made a huge difference. They have the fastest growing light rail system in America. And the Envision Utah Plan is preserving land and helping to make Salt Lake City a greater and greater city all the time. So he's had a lot of impact in Utah. Now he's having impact in the place where more people live on this earth than anywhere else, in China. So when you're planning if you're young and starting out your planning career or architecture career, design career, local official, community activist, whatever, Peter Calthorpe is a good place to start for a role model. Peter Calthorpe.
You know, what Dan warned us against yesterday, hubris, I think is one of our greatest strengths, quite frankly. And there's a very complicated relationship between hubris and optimism. If we never overstep our bounds, I don't think we're ever going to go anywhere. And I think that's a basic approach that I've always taken. Let me see if I can get to my slide. So China, a modest undertaking, but in a certain way, I think a logical next step for CNU. Sometimes I think, well, we've done what we can do in the United States. The seed has been planted. The ideas are ubiquitous. We can argue about the fine points of this standard versus that set of principles, but the idea is there. And if there is any humility that I carry, which is not much, it's that, you know, once you've done that, you have to just stop and see if the rest of the culture will engage, will take it up. There's only so far you can move ideas. And as a matter of fact, I think that actually, I was struck by how we all seem to pivot from CM and Corbu as the antichrist of what we believe in. And somehow we endowed them with the power to have created the world as we know it today, particularly in Asia. And I'm not so sure that we designers and architects and planners are really in charge, no matter how many regulations we write. The reality is other things, much bigger forces are at work. And if we don't recognize those larger forces and somehow find a way to leverage them, I think we are engaging in a kind of hubris that will lead nowhere. So what do I mean by that? I mean, you look at Corbu's drawings and you think, my God, of course, this is exactly the template, and he has led the world to this outcome. I think this outcome was foretold and inevitable. And it's based on forces much larger than the ideas of urban designers and planners. It's based on cheap energy, mass production, HVAC systems, the invention of the elevator, accessible steel. Once the culture has all these facilities at hand, it will inevitably arrive at this. And so, to a certain degree, they were just the guys who were the first ones to draw up what was coming next. And hopefully we're the people who are drawing up what's coming next now. But we're not going to get the drawing right if we don't understand the forces at work and have a certain amount of humility about them. So when CNU says, or some people in CNU say, well, we shouldn't have high-rise buildings, it's a little ridiculous. And if you work in any other part of the world, Asia, the growing segment of the global middle class, you'll recognize that that's just not even close to an option. And probably for good reason. And so it's about taking not so much the inevitable, but the potential of what is at work in our culture and using it and steering it towards a holistic outcome. And so I get a little frustrated, not so much with the regulations, which I've never seen a set of regulations I didn't love, especially when they were written by somebody in this room. But I get a little frustrated with the idea that we can't capture the zeitgeist of the modern world. And, you know, it's interesting to me that over time, that has been the biggest critique of the new urbanism, rightly or wrongly. You know, we all protest it. But there's something larger at work there, and there is a kernel of truth to it. And so it's very, very dangerous. So there it is, the drawing. The drawing does not cause the world. The underlying phenomena of culture and technology and progress drives what you see here in China, which you would think of as a very simple manifestation of CM's regulations. And it's frightening. And it's because I believe we have taken on the charge for the kind of technology and scale that America engaged as a result of these forces. Cheap energy to us and mass production to us turned into 3 cars in the garage and a very low density sprawling environment because we could afford it, because the energy was cheap and we were the only middle class on the planet after World War II. And we had the land. That was the circumstance that we worked with. And it wasn't, those phenomena weren't steered in a healthy direction, and we've done a lot to steer it there. I think we need now to begin to steer the ingredients that produce these kinds of environment into a more benign urban form. And so here's another picture by Corbu. I looked at this picture for a long time and didn't quite see the depth perception in it. But you see the street is below grade. No, the street is at grade, and there is a continuous pedestrian environment raised up 1 level. So this is the, another thing that new urbanists would never touch is the idea of the elevated and segregated pedestrian zone. I'm not so sure about that. Why don't we play around with those ideas? Hong Kong functions totally on this model. The pedestrian realm, which is as vital as any I've seen anywhere on the planet, and which we would all love to have claimed the genesis of, is completely elevated until it hits the hillsides, in which, at what point it actually moves into the natural terrain. So there's a very complex set of opportunities that we seem to bypass when we become dogmatic. You know, China, tragically, most of their intersections now have elevated passageways. But it doesn't create a continuous pedestrian zone, and it really becomes a barrier. So that's a force not handled well. All right. So what do I think is the phenomena driving the world today? And once again, this is a lot of humility here, because I will pontificate about what I think are the major phenomena. But you know, I've always been the master of the obvious and the simplistic, and you know, a lot of people pass over those things because they're not complex enough. And I find the discussion about the economy in America today very interesting, because we all seem to be missing the most obvious thing, which is after World War II, we were the only middle class on the planet. Europe was devastated. India and China hadn't begun to generate a middle class. There was some stuff in South America, but not in any way of a caliber to challenge us. And so our middle class became very, very wealthy. It was an aberration of a particular moment in history. And in 1990, when the Soviet bloc collapsed and when China turned towards capitalism and started to produce a middle class, all of a sudden we weren't the only game in town. And our middle class couldn't command, based on very high blue-collar wages, couldn't command the wealth and the uneven distribution globally of that wealth. And so what are we seeing today? We're seeing the collapse of the wealth of our middle class. And it's not really a collapse. It's actually a fairly modest drawback. But it is a global phenomenon that will not reverse itself. And in the end, what we see in China is the rise of a new middle class. And it's going to take a shape that's quite different than the one that rose in the middle class in America in the 60s. What it means for us as urban designers is here in the United States, a more frugal landscape is in order. And the good news, of course, is that CNU has great prescriptions for that. And it's totally consonant with an environmental ethic and with a design approach that we believe in. So there's a win-win there. But just look at these numbers. In 1960, when we were the dominant middle class, the wealthiest, the most admired place on the planet, our average house was under 1,000 square feet. So perhaps moving back to those levels would be appropriate. And of course, well, there are more statistics here than we want to deal with. At that time, we had one car per household. So maybe that whole prescription of 1,000 square feet and one car is the underlying framework for the urbanism, the next urbanism in America. Those are the kinds of meta trends, I think, that we have to understand and begin to shape by making the right drawing, as Corbu made the right drawing for his time. The other meta phenomena, which I sadly, even my compatriots seem to turn away now from climate change, as if because we can't get a political handle on it, we should ignore it and we shouldn't talk about it. There is no question that we are in the age of climate change. That climate change for the next 100 years will be the challenge of the globe and mankind. There is absolutely no question of that. America happens to be in the denial stage of grief, but that's not going to change the reality of this challenge. And so taking this on is the other, I think, force. The rise of a new middle class at a global scale and the challenge of climate change are the two phenomena that I believe our urban design strategies should focus on. Now, this is a very interesting graph. You can't see it, so I'm going to have to read it. On the left is 1960, on the right is 2008. The different colors represent the urban, the human footprint on the planet. And, oh God. And what's interesting is the global population just about doubled in this period. That's a phenomenal thing. For those of you my age or close to it, the idea that when we were young, the planet had half as many people. I mean, this doubling is an extraordinary event. But look at this. Cropland, which is the green line, remains about the same in terms of the total acreage on the planet in food production. And so as much as we hate the green revolution and all the fertilizers and the damage done, we have to acknowledge, we have to, just like a high-rise, we have to understand that this works. And the planet is not going to give it up because starvation would follow. So either a better way of accomplishing those things, and largely what drives 350 million people moving to cities in China is that they are moving them out of the rural villages so that a more productive, no matter how ecologically destructive, a more productive agriculture will come into being there. And it's those kind of complexities that we need to get our arms around. And once again, that's a phenomenon. The fact that that green line is flat while the population doubles is why China is building cities at a rate that basically will mean they will build enough cities to hold everybody in the United States in the next 25 years. So if the new urbanists don't engage this design opportunity, we are asleep at the wheel. Grazing and cropland, flat. Efficiency up. Efficiency's doubling. And this is the good news. This is why we don't have starvation and pestilence at levels much higher than we see today. Fishing ground footprint goes up. Built up forest land goes up slightly. That's resource retrieval there. Fishing grounds about the same, flat. Built up land is a small component of our environmental footprint on the planet. And then, of course, to translate energy into land area, the carbon uptake, forest, the amount of forest it would take to consume the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere. And you can see what's happening with that. This is the issue of our time. And the red line is biologically one Earth's capacity. So in our lifetime, two things happened. The population doubled, and we crossed a line. For the first time in human history, what we need from the planet is more than what the planet can actually deliver. And this is a startling moment. I mean, this is seminal in the history of mankind in ways I think that people really aren't even beginning to think through. So that red line is one Earth's biological capacity. And around somewhere in 1980s, we crossed that line. And so we have some pretty big issues in front of us. The United States, I mean, maybe I'll skip through these because I think it's too data heavy and I'm not going to get through the whole presentation. So same message here. Per capita, the United States, 23 metric tons. Europe around 10. China 4, India 2. Draw your own conclusions. Carbon emissions in the United States, around 62% of carbon emissions comes from urbanism, transportation and buildings, red and blue. In the rest of the globe, there's other very, very big elements contributing, which is deforestation. So there's a larger pie to work with when you move away from the middle class domain of America. Now, I consider this for us a very important graph. This is mode split, you all know it. The red bar is cars, the green bar is walk, bike, and the yellow, gold is transit. Now, what does this tell us? On the right is China, on the left is the United States. And I think we've all discussed this kind of thing before. Notice that Sweden has way more walk, bike than cars. And of course, transit is at the service of walk, bike. We all understand that. China is now at 12% mode split. They do want cars. They think being middle class involves owning cars. But this is where I do think policies and regulations matter. And maybe they have a system of government which is a bizarre combination of dictatorship and local entrepreneurial spirit at this point. It's a different form. We tend to believe our form is the only and the best form. I think the history will judge. But they now are debating a regulation, a very simple one-number regulation that could change the face of urbanism in China, and that is to limit mode split to cars to 20%. A national policy that just says we are going to design our cities, limit the number of automobiles, and allocate funds to roads and transit and highway and bikeways and all the other modes based on a standard of 20% mode split to cars. It affects everything. It affects the way cities are designed. It affects the way the national government allocates resources to infrastructure projects. Just imagine if we in the United States had such a policy. What would DOT look like if its standard was 50% mode split to cars? What kind of investments would happen in our cities? And where would the planners end up and the designers end up and all the regulatory regime end up? One standard can drive a whole cascade of very positive consequences. So yes, I like metrics and I like regulations because I think without them, without large-scale policy, we really can't. And we've seen the results of the reverse, which is the policies in the United States to overfund highways and finance single-family. We all know the consequences of that. And it's not that somebody drew the wrong urban design picture at some point. It's that those policies were taken in the 50s in the United States. So let's be focused on what it is that matters. So the U.S., now I'll get into the details of design in China and whatnot. You know, the U.S., we think that it's so different. But in a way, I've come to realize that the design challenge in China is the same. It's just an average 16 stories instead of an average 2 stories. It's 8 times the density, but it's exactly the same landscape. We have an arterial supergrid at 1 mile centers because we're low density. And they are the barriers and they are the through roads. And we know the consequences, and we have a landscape of segregated uses. And we know the consequences, you know, air quality, energy, congestion. Now, China is the same thing, but it's a little more compact. They set a super block at 500 meters, approximately. That's their equivalent of our 1 mile grid. And they have the same problem of isolated single uses within that grid. And of course, the grid is a pedestrian barrier just as it is in our physical environment. So in a way, the issues are very much the same, ironically. Now, the uniformity is even a little more extreme, although there are some subdivisions we can get pictures of that look just about like a two-story version of this. Now, the only reason they all line up like this, which we hate, but we're also supposed to love, is solar orientation. And the solar orientation there isn't so much environmental good guy stuff, it's that people actually like sunlight in their homes. And it's become culturally completely normative. You can't, now Dan and I going around and around on, you know, the fact that there are clever architectural tools to get around this. The reality is some people will live without southern orientation, so it's not a perfect system. And of course, they have congestion that makes our highways look tame. I think they had a 40-day lockup at one point around Beijing where they couldn't unwrap a stalled set of freeways. And this is at 12% mode split. Just imagine what's coming for them. Now the good news is they're all engineers and they can imagine it, and they're actually pretty sophisticated. And unlike us, they are fact-based. So if you produce factual information, they actually listen to it and think about it and act on it, which is a very refreshing phenomena for me after having all my data about California basically ignored over the last 3 or 4 years. Now, and of course, the tragedy in China was that it was a walk-bike culture, particularly Beijing. And now it's an automobile culture, and it's because of the way they design streets. They forgot to make places for walk, bike, and they, of course, made grids that were completely inhospitable and environments that were completely inhospitable. Now, as much as there's that, the historic tradition is amazing. You know, there are small shops everywhere, and our anxiety about getting the retail right and getting accessible retail is a no-brainer in China. You can have retail everywhere, on every street. They're very small shops. They're very low-income phenomena, but they're the kind of heart and soul of the Chinese city in the sense that they create not only the affordable, they are the Walmart of China, but they also have a whole network of economies for the people who operate them. And so the truck farm is right there, and all the local goods and services are right there. Now, they're zoning them out of being, and so there is another one of the tragedies. Much of what needs to be redeveloped in China is post-World War II buildings, so poorly built that they can no longer stand and survive in any reasonable way. There's a lot of discussion in our circles around preserving the Hutong. That's a minor issue. The reality is most of the Chinese cities have already been redeveloped once, and they need it to be redeveloped again, and that's one of the new challenges there. So the new and the old, the building in the back will give you a sense. I mean, if you haven't been there, the rise of the middle class is kind of, it's just stunning. You know, it's clear that in many ways they're just as wealthy as we are in their great city centers. Now, the rural environment, of course, has a whole level of poverty that we can't even imagine. There is the center of Beijing, and that is a normal day. One of the times I was flying in there, the smog was so bad we couldn't land. I ended up in Mongolia for 20 hours because of the smog. They get it. They get that this is a problem, and they're searching for solutions. And the reality is new urbanism is a great solution, and they're beginning to understand that. But we need the data, and you know I'm a data nut. So here's a study that we did with the Energy Foundation looking at different neighborhoods in an average city in China. And what we discovered is that there are four fundamental typologies within the city. The old traditional environment of the Hutong and the small streets, which really, you know, are almost too tight to function, but are great places in their own sense. There was a European stage in which a grid was imposed, a more urban grid. After the revolution, Mao put into place in the most communist era the enclave, which were superblocks, but they were thoroughly mixed-use superblocks. So within the superblock you had housing, factory, schools, parks, basically a whole commune within an enclave. And the people were assigned, the people who lived there worked there. So live-work was pretty dominant. And now the latest generation is the superblock, which is the problem. These are just snapshots of the different neighborhoods we studied. And here are the numbers that come out of that. And the purple, of course, is kilometers per household per week. And you can see the startling shift that's taking place. And so this correlation between land use and travel behavior is actually enough to get the attention not only at the highest city levels, but at the national level. So we've been working with the Energy Foundation, which is an American foundation that has a big operation in Beijing and is very well respected as one of the few foreign entities that contributes in a big positive way there. And they have the right kind of connections to see these ideas propagated at the highest level. And we are now writing a design manual called the Low Carbon Cities. This is a kind of synopsis of it. It starts with 8 principles, but each one of these principles has measurable standards in it. And what's fascinating to me is I tried to think that there was some principles that were truly unique to China, but it turns out, no. These principles are unique to human beings and to great urbanism. And so in a way they are kind of universal. But the metrics inside of them are not. Or maybe they are, actually. So neighborhoods that promote walking, street crossings, pedestrian safety and convenience. Well, there's two metrics that go with that, for example. No street should be more than 150 meters to an intersection. Maybe I should translate into English. Is it okay? You can handle it? Well, actually, everybody in this room better learn to handle the metric, because if you don't, you really are going to get left behind. 150 meters. So that's a nice, reasonable scale block on average. And the maximum road width shall be 4 lanes of traffic. 4 lanes. You can design a city with only 4 lanes of automobile activity. And we've demonstrated that you can't. So those are actually, high orders of business. So this idea that we promote walking actually can have some standards that have real measurable consequences and are easy to administer. Ground level activity, okay, the measurable there is that 80% of street frontages shall be shops. Simple, easy to measure. And nobody in China questions that that's viable. So that's the easy good news. It's actually, urbanism is easier at these densities, I guarantee you. High density environments. But one of the fascinating things is, you can throw out William White and all the rest of it. The intensity of human activity is so great in these Chinese cities that you could probably, it would be hard to get a plaza wrong that didn't work, that wouldn't be filled with little ad hoc shops and vendors and activities and people actually performing for each other and doing things. So that urban vitality is so intrinsic that it's hard to miss. And there's a dying need for the return to the pedestrian. Am I going to run out of time? Yeah, but I'm only about halfway through. All right, I'll forget about all the rest of it. Bike, 8 minutes. All right, I haven't even got to the part. Bike networks. I won't go into all the metrics here. Dense networks of streets, 50 intersections per kilometer. High quality transit, regional transit every 1,000 meters. Mixed use. Density, they misallocate density in terms of their transit, and compact regions and energy efficient buildings. So those are the principles. The goal is to turn this kind of environment into this kind of environment. We do it by taking the super block, and lo and behold, another transgression. We substitute couplets for the high capacity through roads. And that way we never get past 4 lanes of traffic and we get no barriers. We then add car-free streets every minimum 800 meters, and we add local streets, and we have a healthy grid. I'm not going to belabor the issue of how couplets work. They are superior to major arterials. They're in every one of our major cities. Every east-west street in Manhattan is a one-way street. Excuse me. If we take that off of our table of strategies, we're idiots. Walking distance. Now, the small block is the big challenge to them. They're used to these big blocks. And so actually framing this small block and setting design standards for it. The good news is the solar access actually creates an environment when you go to small blocks where building heights have to vary. And so the buildings on the north side of the block have to be at such a height that they don't shadow the buildings across the street. The street is only 20, 30 meters, and so the building can only be 20 or 30 meters. So the tall buildings sit on the other side, and all sorts of interesting things start to happen. Build 2 lines, setting a maximum floor plate for the towers is a big struggle. There's actually a lot of arm wrestling we're in now with them because they're used to building slab buildings. The way we approach, and we're trying to create a simple methodology for cities to plan these low-carbon environments. And step 1 is to identify transit-oriented districts. Step 2 is to locate the density at the transit nodes. Step 3 is to create a walkable street grid. And step 4 is to build with a small block mixed use. So here in Chongqing, a 30,000-acre study area, Chongqing, by the way, has 33 million people. It's the size of California. It's hilly, it's beautiful, it's interesting. The study area was a way we could experiment with this methodology. We start with the natural terrain. We preserve all the environmental assets, and this is an idea that's growing in China, that they actually have to protect environmental features that are significant. We look at existing development and areas zoned for the kind of industrial and institutional uses that really can't be walkable and are too low density and too inherently not part of a mixed-use environment. We then look at the highway network, and out of all that we get a series of TODs. And TODs here is transit-oriented districts, not transit-oriented developments. Within those TODs, we look at the metro lines. Look at the metro lines. I mean, it's extraordinary, this investment. These are all subway-level transit opportunities. The stations, and then a hierarchy of TODs, transit centers that focus around that. And so this is a simple framework for how they can go about doing this in all the cities of China. And this is being adopted now in Chongqing. Now here's an example of a community designed, actually, this one right here, this TOD, which is the least likely because it only has 2 metro stops in it. But they gave us this as a study area to show how the other principles would sort themselves in. Beautiful terrain, river, very, very hilly, infrastructure in place. This is the map of the existing plan. All residential superblocks and all industrial superblocks completely segregated. No attention to the transit stations. This is the new master plan, of course, which is fine-grained and mixed use throughout. This is a slope map, so the terrain really began to define how, and actually challenge how we would create a more interconnected network of streets and walkable environments. So just like the Italian hill towns, we preserve the steep slopes around the site, especially as they approach the river, and we concentrate the density at the transit locations. The walkable component here, because of the steepness, is an interesting challenge. It has to do with the street network that's fine-grained and easy to penetrate. And of course, the small blocks become distorted, interesting, unique, which is also a great thing for China. But this is a diagram of the auto-free streets and the pedestrian-only hillside climbs. And so these auto-free streets are everywhere, but just like Hong Kong, they're willing to invest in the pedestrian street. So here you have both covered and escalator facilitated pedestrian movement. So when you're moving vertically a couple hundred meters, which you really couldn't get the pedestrian to do, you give them this kind of environment, they'll do it all day and all night. So we're so used to investing heavily in the automobile, and they actually have a sensibility that says we can invest in the pedestrian, especially as a result of the kind of advocacy that we're going through. The parks and open space permeates and preserves. This is not a sensibility that has been very strong in Chinese planning to date, but there is a growing ecological movement for preservation of real natural resources. And so that's the ULI strategy. And then at the 2 transit stations, higher density and a large public space to gather the energy and the focus of the community. And this is in the regulations also, because the higher density commercial has to be at the transit location. And so this grand ellipse becomes the focal point of the community. Major commercial buildings, God forbid, modern buildings. Actually, in China, you really don't have an option. And I still have not seen a really, anything in China or Asia that questions this. And I don't think this is great architecture. We actually, concocted this in our office. It's kind of ridiculous. We don't do architecture. But the reality is, how important is that? And this is one of our debates all the time. If the street is right, if the activity on the street is right, if the mix and the density is right, you know, how good that facade is and what order of classicism it reverts to may not be the key issue of our time. It may not be the driving force that kind of resolves the biggest challenges to the human being. Do we know and love it? I mean, the reality is in China, they love the public space. And the public space is where they all go, they set up boom boxes and dance. It's amazing. You go to these public squares and they set up music and they go out, and in order to enjoy themselves, they just dance. I'm talking about in the thousands. I tried to put a clip in here, but I was technologically challenged, so I couldn't show you this. So this environment is as much about, note that there's all four modes here. And perhaps the right balance. There's a pedestrian mode, the bikes are coming through here, the buses, the metro, and yet there's a car. By the way, in China, they're not interested in having any street-side parking. Another transgression for us. They can't imagine why they would dedicate public space to dead cars. They just can't, I mean, and I went there with the expectation, you know, as a good new urbanist, that you always have parallel parking. You need it to protect the pedestrian, right? Well, I mean, the idea that you'd have a stationary car in valuable space like that is just silly. And actually, I've come to agree with them. The barrier, the transition from moving cars to pedestrians should be bicycles. We should take out all our parallel parking and put bike lanes instead. I mean, let's get real if change is at hand. And they're going to do that. And of course, once again, 8 times the density helps to make all that viable. And a tradition of biking helps to make it all viable. Numbers, I bet you know what those bars mean. And that one. Now, here's one other case study in the city of Kunming, 6 million, small city, the world's most polluted lake and river that I've ever seen. I mean, there are many problems in China. A new town of 1.5 million. This is the existing master plan. We had to work with an existing master plan. We defined 3 TODs. This institutional red area is a university campus, 10 colleges. 7 years ago didn't exist. And now there's 130,000 students there. They are overtaking us in education because they invest in it. These are the transit centers, the same layers. This is what they've already built, super blocks. Every plan in China has an imitation of Chanang, which is the grand boulevard down the center of Beijing, which is 12 lanes of traffic. And so they all do it because that's normative. This is one of the universities. This is some of the residential development, and you'll see below there the arterial at 5. This is the pedestrian environment. Now, inside the super block, I found a lot of interesting things going on. In this high-rise, there's no sidewalks. They think it's great because it's got landscaping. But because there's no sidewalks and they didn't allow it, the ground floor, where nobody wants to live, is completely empty. It's actually a void. No small shops, no activity, no daily destinations. Over in another one of the projects where they actually had garages, all the garages were turned into small shops. Just goes to show how spontaneous good urbanism can be in that environment. So when we've zoned for small blocks and demand shops on all the sidewalks, it's not heavy lifting. This was the existing plan. A lot of the streets were built, and so we had to work with that. And this is our plan to take it down to scale. Interestingly enough, there's a high-speed rail station here, 2 metro lines, and 3 BRT lines. This is how we handle the street network. The green are couplet streets that replace the blue, which are coming from outside, which are the large arterial pedestrian barriers. So we're able to create a really pedestrian continuity and connectivity. These are the auto-free streets, and this is, you can't read it, all the transit network and things like that. So once again, clustering the density at the transit nodes. This is the green space armature. The thing I'm most proud of here is we took that central spine, which was 12 lanes, and we've convinced them to tear it up and actually build a series of park blocks. So running down the middle with a couplet on either side, one-way street on either side to take the volumes that used to be on that central spine, is now oh, by the way, this is Chanang in Beijing on an amazingly clear day. And turn it into this kind of park block system. And off to the side are the one-way streets, here and here. And so as they build these, they're going to tear up the asphalt here and replace it with parks. A whole series of all the kind of standards that we believe in and the numbers. Finally, our current assignment is perhaps the most challenging in the city of Changsha, an old historic district, with an amazing shopping street running down the middle of it that has already been torn out in, you can see the section below where they have a standard street section. So old and new, once again, since World War II, they have built their own slums. But the slums, the economic life of those low-income communities are right here. Nobody, you could provide affordable housing, which they do, and it's not a problem. But can they have an affordable lifestyle without these small businesses? And this is an argument we make, and they actually are part of it. So when they build this is as you emerge from that amazing shopping street, you get to this environment, which is what they were planning on building through the whole thing. So the argument about that, the economy of those small shops and those small environments are really at the heart of the urbanism that they need to pursue. And with that, I will try to finish up a little too late. Sorry. Thank you.